Oh god, this one is even worse.
At least I get to talk about it with Jose.
When we last met, I was wading through the sewage of Ben Shapiro's 2016 novel, True Allegiance. In that video, I mentioned an earlier book in the Ben Shapiro oeuvre, a collection of short stories from 2015 titled What's Fair and Other Short Stories. Released on Amazon.com as an ebook, this title seems to be less popular than Ben Shapiro's 2016 novel, based on its limited release and lower review count. It bills itself as a collection of short stories, but there are only 3, which I guess meets the technical definition of a collection, but it makes for a far shorter read than I expected. Ben's stories cover 3 genres. There's Americana, sci-fi, and a 16-year-old's live journal page. But to truly see the man at his craft, we'll have to dive right in. Let's go. The titular story in this little tome is What's Fair? In true Ben Shapiro fashion, this story feels like someone trying to cram a bad novel into a few pages and reducing it to a series of basic plot points, all fired off at a rapid pace. This story is told through the eyes of Tommy, who relates his long and troubled history with his older brother Jim. The two grew up on a farm in rural America, and we get a few scenes to illustrate how jealous Tommy is of Jim, typically through the framing of whether or not what happened is fair, at least through Tommy's eyes. The story is written with a painful, homespun narration style, as Ben tries his best to make it sound like he's channeling a genuine American rustic. Here's a sample. I remember a time when I was a kid that Dad gave me and Jim Christmas presents. He gave Jim a wristwatch and he gave me a hunting knife. Boy, was Jim taken with that wristwatch. He'd wear it around every day, rain or shine, always careful to keep it clean, to keep it wound. If he scuffed it up, he'd buff that scuff right out, and he'd spend hours with a handkerchief, spitting on it and rubbing it, spitting on it and wiping it until it looked brand new. Now, if that sounds like it would be annoying to read, you would be right. In this story, Tommy is jealous of Jim's wristwatch, and even though he tries to make the best of it by going hunting with his knife, Tommy eventually loses it in a creek. A detail to remember. Next, we flash forward in time, and Tommy is a senior in high school, and Jim is at a non-specific college that's only ever referred to as State. Tommy has just met Emily, shortened to M. As the star fullback on his school's football team, Tommy has his pick of girls, but he's settled on M, the head cheerleader. He's not only sweet on her, he's convinced M is his future wife. If you're rolling your eyes right now thinking this is some 1950s cliche, you'd be surprised to know that this story takes place in the 90s, or at least the 90s at the very earliest, since Tommy refers to M as a miniature Britney Spears. I'm not sure why she's miniature, since a high school senior is nearly a full-grown adult. With his parents out of town, Tommy brings M back to his place so they can hook up. Instead, he finds Jim has come home for the weekend from State. Then we get this exchange. And that's when Jim opened the door. He was back from State, where he was studying agriculture engineering, and he looked at me, laughing with his eyes, and said, "Hey brother, I'm home." When I turned back to introduce M, she was looking at him. They were married 6 months later. That must have been one hell of a look, and that's quite a jump for 2 sentences in the same paragraph. We never really find out why M is into Jim, though. She just is. In the next paragraph, Tommy and Jim's father dies, and their mother sinks into a deep depression. The farm falls into peril, and Jim and M move back home to take care of things. Soon afterwards, their mother tries to drown herself in the bathtub, but survives the attempt and is left with brain damage. If this all sounds like it's moving too quickly, I've literally just covered 2 paragraphs of this story. Its pace is manic. And if you're wondering if there are any more details on the mother character, let me stop you right there. We don't learn a thing about who this woman is or why she does what she does. She's literally just a perpetual burden on her family, and she doesn't even get a name. Tommy was going to be a football player at State, but he hurts his knee, losing his scholarship, and he's forced to drop out. So now the family is just stagnating at the farm when Jim gets this big idea. He's thought up a special plow that will make them millionaires. While he begins tinkering with that machine for weeks on end, all the work lands on Em and Tommy, who putter along muttering annoyances about the absent-minded Jim. Eventually their mother starts a fire in her room. Tommy and Em race to help her while Jim is too busy with his machine to notice. Just barely, Tommy and Em are able to save Mother. Tommy, obviously upset with his brother who did not notice their mother nearly burning to death in her room, decides to confront Jim in a tense scene in the barn. Sure enough, Jim was under that plow again. I stood there for a minute, then two. It must have taken the bastard 5 solid minutes to notice me. When he did, he got out from under the plow, stood up, gave a kind of little smile, and asked what was wrong. And I knocked him flat on his ass. "Listen, Jim," I said to him, "you've been having it your own way all this time, but some things are gonna change. You've been king of this place for our whole life, but I've had enough of it. I want my piece." There's so much to say about this exchange. Tommy is so pissed. He storms into the barn and then stands there for 5 minutes? That doesn't seem particularly mad. And then, instead of confronting Jim about his negligence nearly getting their mother killed, he instead starts talking about wanting his piece. Tommy never mentions his mother in this scene. He just whines about things being unfair, with Jim getting all the breaks. Jim responds by turning into a character from an Ayn Rand novel. "Tommy," he said, "you don't do anything of importance around here. You think I need you to run this place? I could hire a field hand for 1/4 the price. I'm doing it out of charity for you. You've never held down a real job. You're still going on and on about your days back in high school. Nobody cares anymore. I produce." The spark in his eyes was beginning to return. I knew this meant he was especially mad. "You aren't worth anything. You've got no education. You've got no prospects. You know what Dad told me before I left to school? He said, look after Tommy. If anything happens, Jimmy, he can't take care of himself. So what do you think I've been doing?" I started to talk, but he gave me a look that said I'd better shut my mouth. He kept going. "You know what I've been doing in this barn all this time? Trying to make something for myself and for Em, sure, but mostly I've been trying to take care of you. Still, even though you're sullen and you're lazy and you're ungrateful and you think somehow I've cheated you, even though I spent years helping you with your homework, teaching you the rules of football. Hell, I even got that man from state to come see you play. When this thing makes us $1 million, I'm planning on sending you back to college so you can make something of yourself. But if you want to leave, you pick up and you get the hell out." This diatribe reframes the entire story for us. Now we see Tommy as the big dumb idiot and Jim as the smart, intelligent brother who's just trying to help everyone out. Tommy is just too dumb to see it. Jim's kind offer to take care of his brother is supposed to make him look magnanimous, even after he basically told him he's a useless idiot. Since Jim is a producer, we're supposed to think it's okay that he treats his brother with such disdain. And maybe Tommy is a loser. Maybe his choice of focusing on athletics over academics, and then him ending up getting injured, blew his entire future, and the guy lost his high school crush to his brother. Tommy has had a rough time of it, and maybe he needs a reality check to snap him out of this funk and get him to take responsibility for himself. But you know what that speech doesn't excuse? Letting your mother die in a fire. That's how this critical speech completely fails. If we're supposed to take Jim's side here, it would be a lot easier if he, the supposedly responsible brother, hadn't nearly let his mother die in a fire. Also, Jim technically hasn't done all that much yet. Tommy and Em run the farm, and they're supposed to just assume Jim will invent their way into a fortune. The story gives us no reason to believe this will happen, and if anything, Jim comes off as unbearably smug in this monologue, so naturally Ben has decided he's the good guy in this story. After this, we move on to a scene where Tommy runs into Em late at night, finding her sobbing about her miserable life as a farm wife taking care of a sick old woman. Tommy figures this is a great time to talk about hooking up again. Naturally, it doesn't work. Embarrassed at his lack of game, Tommy runs into the woods, and while passing by the creek, he finds his old knife. Sparkling like new. I'm not sure how this knife is still in such good shape and hasn't moved in the last 15 years, but such is the magic of forced storytelling. A few days later, Jim calls Tommy into the barn to tell him his new plow has finally been finished. He brings Tommy into the barn to take a look and to talk about how their lives are about to take a turn for the better. And then this predictable twist happens. This is Tommy talking to Jim. He hopped over to me like a jackrabbit and grabbed me by the arms. "Kiddo, we're all set from here to the flood. You're a junior partner in the firm, and we're headed right to the top." His smile was infectious. I could feel myself smiling too. And then the knife was up under his ribs. He looked so confused for a minute. I was confused too. "I can explain it to you, Tommy. It turns out you were in a very forced and contrived retelling of the Cain and Abel story. One jealous brother murders the other. Unlike Cain, though, Tommy gets away with the crime by pretending the plow is what killed his brother. Or at least, he seems to get away with the crime. In the next scene, Tommy tries to sell the plow to make those millions, but he can't get it to work. Turns out there's something wrong that I guess Jim can only fix. So Tommy goes home with no money and a busted plow. Em eventually packs up and leaves the farm, and Tommy is left alone taking care of his sick mother. What this story is so pointedly pressing upon us is the idea that people are born with unalterable traits, essential components that make them who they are, which can never be changed. Tommy was born dumb, and Jim was born smart. Their lives reflect this internal trait, and they have no way of escaping this biological reality. The best Tommy can hope for is Jim taking care of him. And all Jim needs from Tommy is for Tommy to get the hell out of his way. What's most strange about this story is it pretends circumstances are meaningless, and that even when you have a person like Tommy who is apparently cared for, he still can't escape the lowness he was born with. I'll have more to say about this idea of essentialism during the third story. You know, I did like the idea of an unreliable narrator whose bias is revealed when confronting the characters he covets. Maybe in the hands of a talented writer, this could have actually been really good. But here's a spoiler for the next two stories before we get into those. What's Fair is easily the best story in the book. And with that ominous revelation, let's move on to the next one. Our next stop in the Shapiroverse is the science fiction story From the Pit. This is a tale of the far future where our hero, a man named Kemp, is fighting for his survival against hordes of dust mites for the sake of his rich benefactor. And yes, I did say dust mites. In this vision of the future, a wealthy man, only referred to as the Whale, hires thousands of people to be shrunk down to less than a millimeter, which is about 4/100ths of an inch, so they can shoot dust mites in the face. Now, before we continue with the plot, I need to acknowledge that this is maybe the dumbest plan to eliminate dust mites I've ever heard. Why not, say, make the humans big enough that the dust mites can't harm them and just spray them like roaches? Why not skip shrinking humans entirely and use chemicals from the get-go? Why not just write a story that doesn't have such a bad premise? Of all the stories in this collection, this one is in the most desperate need of some copy editing. Here's an actual sentence from the story. 2 years. That was the length of that damnable contract. I though the money would enough. Did no one read this over? I though the money would enough. And the rest of the paragraph reads, a guaranteed pension for life, an endless income, a nice house above the bay with the wind blowing off the sea, Amy in my arms. She warned me against this. She was right. I was wrong. Sentences either run on for way too long, or they're too short and snippy. It doesn't use commas properly, and I though the money would enough. And don't worry, that's not even the worst grammatical flub in this story. But back to the plot. Kemp pines for Amy, an absent love interest that reminds us he has something to live for in light of the horrors that come. Kemp fights a bunch of dust mites in a confusing battle scene where he's hanging off the side of a cigarette when the Whale, a clean freak who is also a compulsive smoker, decides to light up the cigarette and take a drag. In the chaos, Kemp falls into the Whale's mouth, and thanks to his little protective bubble called a halo, he manages to affix himself to the side of the whale's stomach. A man trapped in the belly of a whale is an obvious reference to the story of Jonah and the whale from the Old Testament. In that story, after Jonah turned his back on his mission as a prophet, God had him swallowed up for a few days by a giant fish. Jonah eventually is thrown up and then becomes a prophet. In this story, Kemp is learning the error of wanting to make money from a rich guy who has a really weird method of killing dust mites. So not exactly the same. Or similar. While sitting in the stomach, Kemp sees the awful truth about the whale. He has a tumor. And an ulcer, which is something I'm just mentioning because it'll be used as a plot device later on. Somehow Kemp knows the tumor is really bad, so bad that the whale will be dead in a couple of months. We haven't gotten any information that Kemp has any sort of medical training or knowledge. This is just something he knows. This knowledge about the tumor could make Kemp fabulously wealthy. And that does make sense, knowing that some big important business dude is going to be dead in a couple of months is prime blackmail material. Kemp, though, isn't a bastard and doesn't want to take advantage of this situation. Kemp radios his buddy Jensen, letting him know he's trapped in the stomach and that he's seen the whale's tumor. He promises not to say a word about it to anyone. Jensen tries speaking to the whale, but he doesn't believe Kemp and decides he's just going to kill him. It's at this point in the story where we get a truly mystifying line that, I suspect, is the subtext for this entire story. I'm going to be a bit of a jerk though and not reveal it until we get to the very end. As we move along, try and guess what this story is secretly an allegory for. The whale calls a doctor to have Kemp killed, and their plan is to send in robotic dust mites to hunt him down. These were going to eventually replace shrinking humans down to fight dust mites, and I don't know why they just didn't start with the robots, but this is the story we have. Inside the stomach, Kemp has decided he's just going to let himself grow back to full size and rip his way out of the whale. And to do that, he's going to have to fight his way through the robotic dust mites. Reversion to his normal size is a gradual process for Kemp, so at this point, he's about twice his starting size, so probably 1/10 of an inch, assuming he started off as slightly larger than a dust mite. As the dust mites tear open the halo protecting Kemp, he comes out fighting, kicking his way past them and climbing up the stomach lining. Of course, since his tiny little clothes have all ripped off, he's doing it naked, burning his hands and feet on the stomach lining. As he climbs into the esophagus, one of the dust mites bites off Kemp's leg. Then we get this doozy of a typo. For context, Kemp is pulling himself into the esophagus, which looks like a constricting ring from his perspective. Finally, I pry the damn thing open, pull myself halfway through, and it closes around my waist. I'm trapped, the clicking sounds of the mites closer and closer. I'm sorry, it closes around your... what? Your waist? Is Kemp in the process of relieving his bowels here? Or did someone just not know how to spell waste? Of course, I'm sure Ben knows how to spell waste properly. This just speaks to the importance of copy editors and how they're your friends. And if you employ one and have them look over your work, they'll keep it from looking like waste. Somehow, Kemp pulls himself to safety and uses what's left of the stomach acid to cauterize the wound. Of course, acid liquefies flesh, making it a horrible fluid to cauterize anything. Missing a leg and sitting in the esophagus, Kemp decides he'll have a little nap. And by little nap, I mean really long sleep. September 23rd. I've lost all sense of time. I can tell by my size, I'm now about 3 inches tall, that it's been another 36 hours. How can you lose all sense of time and then be able to tell it's been 36 hours? And how on earth did the whale go 36 hours without eating any food that would have surely dislodged Kemp? And how did he sleep, I guess standing up, in the esophagus, missing a leg for 36 hours? It's at this point Kemp revises his plan, instead opting to climb out of the esophagus instead of just bursting through the whale's guts. And we get this funny little scene where Kemp punches the whale from inside of his throat. It's stupid and random, but it's the only part of the story I liked. It's just this adorably pathetic little gesture of a tiny man. The whale gets desperate and the doctor pulls out their trump card, some ipecac, which will induce vomiting. By vomiting up that stomach acid, it would burn Kemp to death. Kemp thinks quickly and decides to go back into the stomach, this time with a plan. He heads towards the ulcer. Remember that thing from a little earlier? He starts tearing at it, getting it to start bleeding, and for some reason this attracts all the robotic dust mites. I don't know how Kemp knew this would happen, or why it happens at all, but it does. Here's a fun fact. Dust mites don't drink blood. Maybe the robotic ones are different, but I'm not sure why anyone would program them to drink human blood. That seems like a weird thing to program a robot to do. But now let's think about this plan for a moment. When it begins, the Doctor has already given the whale the ipecac, and according to Kemp, he has seconds to pull all of this off. Just a few seconds now before the geyser of acidic vomit comes up, finishing me. I rub my right leg, what's left of it, and look down through the ring. Ipecac is washing through the stomach. The mechanical mites are swimming around in it. Soon they'll be joining me, along with the acid, unless I join them first. The ulcer, it's the only chance. Kemp somehow knew to use the robotic dust mites to attack the ulcer. He somehow knew the Doctor would then, on the spot, decide to cut open the whale to get it out. And in that whole mess, Kemp would jump to freedom. And that's the genius plan that Kemp just came up with on the spot. And what about that impending vomit after the whale swallows the ipecac? I think Ben just kind of forgot about it because it's never mentioned. Kemp was in the stomach the whole time, so it would have killed him. The impending vomit acid just never arrives. Also, it's really impressive that Kemp pulls off this entire plan with one leg. That's one heck of a plan coming together. The story ends with the whale demanding that the Doctor kill Kemp, but Jensen decides to murder the Doctor instead to save his friend. The whale, who at no point vomits in this story, presumably bleeds out because he has a giant hole in his stomach. So with the story now told, have you figured out the subtext? It's really tough because even when you know and you can see the connections more clearly, it still doesn't make any sense. I'm going to read this revealing passage for you now. This is a conversation the whale has with Jensen after he decides to murder Kemp. Kemp is listening to this conversation from inside the stomach. Jensen swallows. I can hear it all the way across the room, not even through the beacon. Sir, he says, that would be pure murder. Yes, says the whale, but it's my body, and what's in it is my purview. That's the law. Look it up, but look it up after you call the Doctor. This story is about abortion. Yeah, that basically gives it all away, huh? So now do we talk about how a living being grows inside a person, or there's a cesarean operation, or a doctor is being called upon to be complicit in murder? Sometimes a story's narrative is so bad, so clumsy, and falls so hard on its face that the only fitting criticism is to tell everybody what happens in it. So let's move on to the next story. Utopia is the shortest of the three stories and easily the worst one. Mostly because it's not really a story, just a drab portrait of what Ben believes a socialist utopia would look like. One where everyone lives the same life, with every part of it decided for them by the government. Our hero is a nameless protagonist who lives in this sheltered society, trapped in a giant bubble cut off from the rest of the world. He goes about his drab life working at some random factory where his job is turning a spigot on and off. On Wednesdays, he plays cards with some strangers, Tuesdays, he hooks up with a random woman, and on Thursdays, he goes out and looks at the stars. Ben gives us a world where there are no relationships, not romantic ones, and not even friendships. This socialist utopia means giving up all those things as people come and go out of your life and no meaningful connection is ever made. On one of his stargazing nights, our protagonist looks up at the sky and notices a comet streaking through the night. It happens to be Halleys Comet, which passes by every 75 years, although this only gets revealed a little bit later on. Somehow, seeing this comet awakens something in our protagonist. Here's how the book describes it. And suddenly, his hazy dream burst into consciousness. He found himself standing, tears rolling down his face, gazing up at the sky. A terrible longing filled him, a feeling of dread and of hope, a new feeling, an old feeling. The star tore the night apart, leaving day falling behind it. When he looked around him, he saw thousands of eyes and thousands of faces staring at him, blankly. The star hit the horizon. He turned and ran. Every line is so breathless in Ben's writing. It's like he imagines every story to be utterly captivating and demands the reader be enthralled along with him. This reader was annoyed by the tiny sentences that never offered anything of depth or value. There are just these tiny little descriptions of plot points, only filled with the barest scantest of details that seem completely perfunctory. And what exactly is happening in this moment? A transformation, yes, but how and why? And what exactly is changing here? Let's see if the story will answer that for us. The protagonist's dash is immediately noticed by the Ministry of Protection. There are a lot of ministries in this book, but this is the only one that actually does anything. Several enforcers are dispatched to chase after the protagonist. They try using this thing called the pulse, which is some kind of weapon that uses sound to incapacitate people. When they try using it on our protagonist, this happens. Behind him, the pulse crescendoed. He could feel the hair on his arms stand on end, his knees begin to buckle. Soon, he knew, his legs would give out, his head fry from the pulse. Yes, his head fry from the pulse. Good copy editing there, by the way. But it didn't. The enforcer's eyes widened in shock as the pod approached. He was well within range of the pulse now, yet nothing was happening. Nothing. Another enforcement pod opened up with the pulse, full bore. Nothing. A smile creased his worn face. He slowed to a jog, then a walk. Then, finally, he stopped dead and turned around facing his pursuers. As he did, the pods backed away, as though called away by some higher power. He turned again and ran toward the mountain. I have no idea why this pulse, which we've not heard about until now, doesn't work. It just doesn't, and this is never explained in the story. And this mountain location is mentioned for the first time right here. I don't know why the protagonist knows to just run towards it, but that's what's happening. What's even funnier is that Ben doesn't even know how his protagonist knows about the mountain. He didn't know how he knew about the mountain. The Ministry of Environment never talked about it. Nobody knew the words mountain or valley. He couldn't even see the mountain thanks to the bubble, the protective climate change artificial environment that made all land even and flat, fruitful and evenly graded. Nobody he knew had ever been outside the bubble. The protagonist runs towards the mountain, but is stopped by the dome of his enclosure. Eventually, for unnamed reasons, the doorway is opened, and the protagonist is allowed to approach the mountain. As he approaches, the protagonist sees a sign that reads, "The Creed of Ignorance." This, for the unfamiliar, is how Winston Churchill referred to socialism. The full quote reads, "Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy." Why would socialists put up part of a quote that makes them sound like the bad guys? And that quote basically encapsulates this story. People living in this socialist utopia all think they're happy, but they're actually under a mass delusion that our nameless protagonist has broken out of, somehow. Let's read on and see if we get an answer to that. You probably guessed we aren't though, right? Yeah, you probably figured that out. A chamber inside the mountain houses an old man and his many books. He's bedridden and just kind of laying there when our protagonist finds him, and the two have a weighty conversation. Here's the closest we get to understanding what sent our protagonist on his journey. Halleys Comet. I know you don't know what that is. Never mind about that. Suffice it to say that it shows up once every 75 years. Your father and mother must have seen it at some point. At that, he spoke. I never knew my father and mother. But you remember the comet. I don't know what I remember. And then they move on. If you want answers to nonsensical plot twists, or in this case, the entire premise, Ben Shapiro isn't the writer for you. But maybe I'm being nitpicky. It might not matter what brought us to this point. We have a social outcast from a socialist society who's confronting a man revealed to be one of that society's architects. This is the moment this was all building to, so maybe it'll pay off, and of course it's not going to pay off, but let's find out what happens. In the minds of the socialist, according to this story, the problem is diversity. The differences between people create strife and discord. Let's let the old man explain it. For no matter what measures government tried, inequality remained. Redistribution of resources merely masked the problem. Laws directed toward helping particular groups often ended with them being strangely disadvantaged. Different abilities bred different values, different belief systems. Those values and systems caused conflict. We tried everything to solve it. We tried education, we tried genetic treatments designed to raise the average intelligence, but each IQ point meant a massive difference in outcome. There's something very sinister happening here, and I don't just mean the swipe at the welfare state. What Ben is presenting to us is a reading of diversity amongst cultures as the product of genetic differences. That is to say, the reason some societies differ from others, and more importantly, why some societies perform better than others, is because of their genes. This story is resting very heavily on the idea that some people, or in this case, some groups of people, are simply born better than others. And he pulls it out to mean that this is a product of our genes and is completely inescapable, regardless of how we engineer society. It completely disregards history, environments, both physical and social. If some cultures do better than others, ultimately it can only be explained because their people are genetically superior. If we don't want to talk about culture, we can also talk about class. Rich people are rich because they have superior genes compared to poor people. They were simply born to be better. In this story, because the old man specifically refers to breeding programs that needed to be used to filter out the differences between people, it's literally talking about eugenics. The line towards race realism here is pretty direct. For those who don't know, race realism is a pseudoscience that tries to justify racism through a misunderstanding of genetics and overemphasis on arbitrary physical characteristics. I don't want to get too sidetracked here, but if you want to know why this is nonsense, I've included a few links in the description below. It's all nonsense, and it's used to explain away some of history's worst crimes. The old man describes his ideals. Equality is the key. Equality cannot be achieved in excellence. It can only be achieved in mediocrity. And we have achieved it within the bubble. All are equal. All want nothing. Aspire to nothing. It is perfect. It is stasis. It took generations. 3 generations to breed out the intelligent, to select out the unique. We have more disease now, but we have no unhappiness. More poverty now, but shared by all. This operation to create equality didn't take with our protagonist, though. When the old man tells him happiness is a myth, that nothing can make man happy because of our internal desires to do better, and eventually failing, becoming unhappy, the protagonist responds, "No," he said. "It is happiness to be so unhappy." What he's saying so clumsily is the pursuit of greatness, even if it falls short, is what makes people happy. Maybe because we fall short and always have something to strive towards. Although I'm putting words in his mouth a little here, especially with that last sentence, because instead of getting more detail about what I suspect is the whole point of the story, we get a cringy action scene instead. 2 enforcers have showed up to the mountain to take our protagonist away. The old man has decided an independent man, like our protagonist, is trouble. Here's one really bad part. It's describing the actions of our protagonist in this scene. He leapt to the bookcase. His hand gripped a volume. "The Pentateuch," it said, and he pulled it from the bookcase. The withered man was screaming now. In anger or despair, he could not tell. He swung the heavy volume, metal-edged, at the other enforcer, who was moving towards him with a slow certitude. The book crunched into the enforcer's skull, and he toppled to the floor with a crash. For the unfamiliar, the Pentateuch are the first 5 books of the Old Testament. Yeah, this story literally has someone being beaten to death with a holy book. Subtle, this story is not. The protagonist confronts the old man, accusing him of ruining mankind's potential, and then he uses a pillow to smother the old man, saying, "You protected us from our humanity, from our possibility. May God," the word jumped again to his mouth, "may God forgive you." In one fell swoop, our protagonist has found God and killed his oppressor. And the story ends with him wandering off into the wilderness to see if there are other painfully contrived morality tales he can appear in. One of the biggest problems this story has is that there's no internal logic to the plot. The main character realizes something somehow. He is pursued until he isn't, and then he is again. And he knows about places before knowing about them. That last part in particular is a problem, since so much of this story is dedicated to describing the main character's ignorance. He doesn't know what ants are, he's never seen books, he doesn't know what mountains are, he doesn't know what a comet is, but he knows the mountain when he needs to, and he knows anything he needs to know when the plot requires him to. When he realizes that his life is unfulfilling and makes him unhappy, the story is trying to convey this inner truth, as if the knowledge of wanting more out of life is some kind of natural impulse that can't be extinguished, only hidden. It's not a terrible point, but the problem is here, in the story of free will and not having life dictated to you by the government, ironically makes its protagonist seem like a marionette dancing on its author's strings. How can this be a story of free will and self-determination when it's so painfully contrived and forced? This is how terrible writing can ultimately undermine any point an author is trying to make. The worldview here is ultimately one built on selfishness and tribalism. It not only seems to be fine with one group of people having a higher concentration of wealth to the detriment of others, it also says that they are inherently worthy of that higher position in society. Think back to the talk about diversity creating strife because some groups have superior genes. This is presented as the natural order. In this story's world, socialists are trying to upset a natural order where the superior people make more money and the inferior ones live in squalor. It's a full-throated defense of capitalism, using racist pseudoscience as an excuse for not having to care about the poor. And it's a pretty terrible short story, too. Part of me wants to look back and have some sort of grand conclusion now that I've read the complete works of Ben Shapiro's fiction, but a bigger part of me would like to simply fade away and never think about this dark period in my life. Although if he publishes another book, I will definitely be reading it. Not buying it, but definitely reading it. Whew, so, yeah, another Ben Shapiro literature adventure for all of you. For those wondering, I did not purchase this short story collection, and I very much recommend against doing that. It's very bad, and you would be giving a bad man money. Don't do it. Not all of my videos are going to be about terrible conservative fiction in the future, though I might do a few now and then, if anything catches my eye. The names you see on the screen are my lovely patrons. If you've enjoyed my videos, please consider making a monthly donation if it's within your means. It really does help a lot. I know these videos don't look like it, but they do actually cost time and money to produce. So anyone who would like to contribute to helping me make more videos, I very much am grateful for that support. A special shout out to my patron who decided to donate $5.69. Hell yeah. That's the sex number. If you enjoy this video or this channel, definitely like, comment, and subscribe. Also hit the little bell to get reminders. You can follow me on Twitter, ask me a question on Curious Cat. Thank you so much for watching.